Fox River NRD-A is the program that benefits wildlife from the PCB pollution and cleanup in Fox River. There's sister authorities. Superfund cleans up those kinds of things for humans, and the Natural Resource Damage Assessment cleans up those properties for wildlife. And once the final settlement was made, they set up a technical team that reviewed projects on how to spend, request to spend some of the money, and they make the recommendations that go to the final trustee council that then distributes the money. So he's involved, even though he does all his work, most of his work within the Menominee Reservation, he is involved in making decisions and reviewing projects. So that's pretty special as well. He enjoys fishing and hunting and skiing. That should say downhill skiing. I think he spent his last 3 evenings over at Wausau, taking in some late season skiing. And he also does wood turning. And he actually showed me some of his pictures of the bowls he made, and they're just very, very well done. And he's been working on sturgeon restoration on the reservation since 1996. So he almost has 30 years into that. So there's a lot about the Menominee Nation that I don't know. That's why I'm very excited now, myself, to introduce Jeremy Pyatskowit to talk about fisheries in the Menominee Nation. Please welcome.
Thanks, Mark. So when Mark called, I was excited to come over and do a presentation because it's a crowd different than what I usually might talk to. So it's like, usually I'm talking to other tribal members that are disgruntled about something. So people are here because they want to hear something I have to say for fun. So it's I mean, folks know, you know how it is. So tonight we are going to cover a lot of ground. So we're going to lay the groundwork with history of the tribe. Mark alluded to like kind of the area, how much time we've been here. We're going to then transition into sort of what our fishery program does on the Menominee Reservation. And then we're going to spend some time with Lake Sturgeon and their relationship with the tribe and what we've been doing working on those for the past 30 years, even though our history with them goes back much longer than that. So we're going to start with the creation story, like I said, way back. So the creation story states that, whoops, I guess if I turn too far, I disappear. The creation story states that the tribe started at the mouth of the Menominee River, which is the red dot, which is almost straight across the bay from us here. So in the story, as you can see, a great bear emerged from the ground, took human form, and it asked other animals to come along with him to form the tribe. So we have 5 principal clans, and under each of those, there's a number of other ones. So there's like 34 total clans, but the 5 clans that you see here have listed sort of the responsibilities that clan has within the tribe. So that's kind of how our tribe is structured, with a clan structure. And members now in the tribe will tell you which clan they belong to. So my family historically went back to the Wolf clan, which would have been a hunter-gatherer, which really, I guess I'm the hunter part of it, not the gatherer. But. So as Mark mentioned, we covered a lot of ground. So history tells us that we were all over pretty much most of Wisconsin, down into Illinois, over into Minnesota, up into Michigan. I think we probably would have been further up into Michigan if they would have built the Mackinac Bridge sooner, because we could have got across there. So that might have gone up a little further than it is now. And as we're speeding along through history, we get to the treaty era. So most tribes have some sort of stories or things that happened during the treaty era. And this is a fairly busy map. So you can see there were a number of treaties that the Menominee tribe had with the federal government. And most of them had to do with ceding land or selling land to the federal government. The big ones to take account of, well, let me back up for a second. So you can see the bigger areas. I'll talk about some of the smaller ones first. So we, out of our lands, ceded lands to other tribes to have reservations here that came from other places, mostly out east. So the Stockbridge Muncie Band is located right next to see, up here. So that was 2 townships out of our original reservation that we gave them for their reservation. And you can see kind of in the middle here, these lands were ceded for the Oneida Reservation, which started out a little larger and they ended up a little bit smaller down by Green Bay as well. So there's 2 really important dates on here. One is in 1848. At that time, the tribe had signed a treaty to cede all the lands in exchange for 600,000 acres over in the Crow Wing territory of Minnesota, which is kind of in the Brainerd region. And at the time, the tribe had agreed to it, but then they decided we should probably check this out first. So we sent a delegation over there to look at the lands. And when they got there, we found these guys, and we were like, I don't know, you know, and we're gonna go back to Green Bay. So the tribe sent a delegation to meet with President Fillmore to talk about not wanting to move over there. And ultimately we got like another year to stay where we were in Wisconsin. And that led to the development of the Treaty of 1854, which gave us our current reservation. So the importance of the region of where the reservation is today is Kashina Falls is there and the Wolf River runs through there, and the Wolf River is part of the Winnebago system. And sturgeon have always been a very important species and fish that the tribe utilized culturally. So one of the reasons that they picked that area was because that was one of the primary spawning grounds of Lake Sturgeon, which were important to the tribe as a food source. This is just an interesting picture. So it's fairly easy to pick out the reservation. It's the big forested region there. Other thing that of note, you can see the tornado track. So that was, I don't know, like 10 years ago or whatever. No, and it's just interesting to see kind of the track it took and, you know, how nature acts. So it's interesting when we talk about the forestry on the reservation. So they talk about like clear cuts and things, mimicking nature of, you know, taking all the trees down and things like that. And I would always tell the foresters, well, shouldn't we just like swipe a line on the map and mow everything down? Because that's sort of what a tornado actually does, but they didn't like my idea. So jumping forward another 100 years. So over that time, in that 100 years, you know, the original plan was to try and get Indians into agriculture, like lots of places. We had a heavily forested reservation, and our tribe was interested in managing the timber on the land and selling the timber. So we started working with that with the government. They built a sawmill. We became relatively productive and progressive for tribes at that time. And the federal government then determined that we were successful enough that they thought we could live without having that recognition and assistance from the federal government anymore. So in 1954, the tribe's federal recognition was terminated, which kind of sent things into a tailspin for the tribe, as it were. So what the tribe had was transferred into a Menominee Enterprises Incorporated, and out of the reservation, a county was formed. And since it was rural, mostly timberland, not having a tax base, Legend Lake was built in 1968 to create a tax base for the newly formed Menominee County. So Legend Lake is an 1,100 acre impoundment. So if you'll notice on the bottom, that's what Legend Lake looks like now. And that was made out of 8 original lakes. So 2 lakes here, and they connected up to these lakes over here and all the way over to here. So it's about 7 miles long. And so that is largely a recreational lake now. So there's an interesting mix of fee properties or county properties and tribal properties around the lake. So it's one of the only places on the reservation where you have non-tribal folks that live on fee land as a result of what happened back with the termination in 1954. So this is just a picture of the reservation where the county lines used to run. So the interesting thing right here is the county line right here between Oconto County and Shawano County runs right through. So we were part of sort of two different counties at the time before termination came about. So there was a group of tribal members that was interested in getting that federal recognition back. So in the early 70s, they started working on getting that process started, getting before Congress, because it was going to take an act of Congress to make this happen. And in December 22nd, 1973, that actually happened, and that restored the tribe back into being a federal recognized tribe. So as a result, we developed a constitution that we did not have before and developed a tribal government. So the tribal government with the tribe, we operate with a legislature. You'll hear the term council a lot of times. Other tribes use councils. I think we're one of the few that uses the legislature. I think Oneida uses like a business committee. So each tribe, depending on how they were formed, uses a slightly different form of government to govern themselves. So let's switch gears a little and talk just about like fishery management on the reservation. So the species we have on the reservation are very similar to what you find in a lot of upper Midwestern lakes. So it's like more of a bass, panfish, pike. We have walleyes in some lakes that are there because we stock them, not because they're natural. And lake sturgeon in some areas, and then we have in the rivers and streams, we have typically, it would have been historically just brook trout, but brown trout in most of the streams now as well. Regulations, we'll talk about how those are developed and then go through some of the management activities that we are currently doing. So water resources, you can see in the reservation, there's lots of blue. So we have 53 lakes on the reservation, 187 streams and rivers that accounts for over 300 miles of streams and rivers that run through the reservation. So bear in mind that despite the high number, not all of them are like pristine trout streams. You know, we're like everywhere. You have some small warm water streams, some bigger rivers like the Wolf River runs almost right through the middle, and then some fairly good sized tributaries that run into the Wolf. So regulations. Sometimes there's misconceptions about what tribes have when it comes to regulations. Some people think there's no regulations. They do whatever they want. Regulations don't apply to them. So within the tribe, we govern ourselves and we have regulations for hunting and fishing. So how we develop those is we have a conservation commission that's made up of 7 members, and they make recommendations to the legislature on the hunting and fishing rules. So ours follow a 3-year cycle. My department gives recommendations to them based on what we're doing for management activities and surveys. And then they'll put those into the regulations, and then the legislature has the final approval of all the regulations that come forth. So there are times where they may approve all the regs minus one thing, or maybe send them all back to get worked on. It depends on, you know, the makeup of the legislature and what the proposed changes are. We talked a little about the species, the seasons. For tribal members, seasons are for most things other than trout are open all year round. For permittees, which include first generation descendants, spouses, and clergy, for fishing especially, the seasons will mimic sort of what the state has for their seasons, for their opening day, closing dates. Bag limits may be a little higher, maybe a little bit lower, depending on the species that we're talking about. So we do basically 2 types of surveys on there. So we have manage the lakes and then we manage the streams. So on the lakes, bigger lakes that get more use, we tend to spend more time on them, getting surveys a little more often. The one advantage we have compared to the state, so the state has obviously a lot more lakes that we have to deal with. So their rotation tends to be a little bit longer. We have the advantage of being able to go in there on a much more frequent basis to take a look at those fisheries and stay on top of them a little bit more. So that's an advantage we have. Even though we have a small staff for it, we have one biologist and then some techs that help them out, but they can get a lot done, you know, just that small crew, mostly due to the fact that we don't have tons of lakes that we have to hit every year. We use a combination of electrofishing and pike nets, various things in analysis, and then, as I mentioned before, the recommendations that we propose are based on what they're finding based on the trends in populations and sizes and those sorts of things. So this is an example of just a couple pictures of some of those things that they're out there doing. So on the right, they're emptying a pike net, so the net's off the front of the boat, and they're just dipping the fish out, they put them in a tank, and then they're all weighed, measured, and then let go. On the left, we do get some incidental catch in our nets. So one thing you'll note is, I think we told everybody to smile. So this could be the first recorded snapping turtle smile that anybody's ever seen. So if you ask another one, that might be what you get. So stream surveys, similar to lake surveys, we get out and the biologist gets out on most of the larger streams, since there's not as many to deal with, on almost every year if he can. Smaller streams, not quite as much. So when they do the surveys, he does something, what's called an index of biotic integrity. So using the assemblage of species that they find, depending on whether they're cold water, cool water, warm water fish, it'll tell you sort of like, here's like the integrity of the stream. So you can use that number over time as you continue doing surveys. If that starts going up or down, it may indicate you have some sort of issue from either management or environmental or something that you may have to deal with out there. So that's why it's important that, you know, they get out there as much as possible, because obviously trout are a little bit more sensitive than other species, being a cold water species. And similarly, we create management recommendations based on the surveys that the biologist does and submit those to the commission to help manage our resources. So we got a couple of pictures. So on the left, they are doing electrofishing on one of our trout streams. So one thing you'll note on the stream is, if people trout fish a lot, sometimes you have this vision of like out west fishing where it's all like nice and wide open, you know, the guy's got his fly rod, he's casting as far as possible. And, you know, where we are, it's a little more dense and, you know, there's a lot of stuff growing across the streams, but all that woody structure in the streams is excellent for trout habitat. So the trout fishing tends to be pretty good. So you can see on the right, that's one of a nice brook trout that they picked up during one of the surveys. So this is what they might look like when they're going out. They have, in this one, they're using backpack electrofishing equipment. So typically you have two backpack things, and then each person will have another person with a net to help them net all the fish that they get using the electrofishing equipment. So one thing very unique to the reservation. So in Upper Bass Lake, there's two lakes in Wisconsin that have kokanee salmon in them. And Upper Bass Lake is one of them. And the other lake is just right above that is Florence Lake up in Langley County. And also in Upper Bass Lake, it connects to a trout stream. So we have brook trout that come up and utilize the lake. And there's rainbow trout that got in there from the same place that the kokanee salmon came from. So the story I've heard is there was somebody north up on Drew Creek, which flows into Florence Lake, which then comes into Upper Bass Lake, was raising kokanees and rainbows for consumption. And at some point, he just let them all go into Drew Creek, and they found their way and they took off, leading to a self-sustaining population of kokanee salmon, which is, I think, one of the few populations actually east of the Mississippi. They're they're a landlocked sockeye. You find them out west in reservoirs and places like that, but typically not this far east. So for reference, Upper Bass is the highlighted lake way up in the top corner of the reservation, and Florence Lake is the next lake just above that. So here's an aerial view, so you can see them a little bit closer. You got Upper Bass Lake right in the middle here, then Florence Lake. So Upper Bass it's a clear lake. It's about 40 feet deep, so it's got the sufficient depth for trout to maintain themselves in the summertime. So people will catch kokanee in the summer and in the fall, occasionally. Not a lot of people like really target them, even though they're there. Usually if somebody gets them, they just get one accidentally when they're doing other things. And we have an example of two. So the one on the left is a juvenile, and then they go through a 4-year spawning cycle like other salmon do. So the males, at the end of their 4 years in order for spawning, similar to other ones, they get like big teeth, the hook in their nose, the bright red color. And I have to talk to our tech about pictures because he shouldn't look like he's wanted in 4 states for bank robbery when we take pictures. So I mentioned walleyes earlier. The tribe has 4 1-acre rearing ponds. So we get walleye fingerlings from the Fish and Wildlife Service as summer fingerlings. So they're about 2 to 3 inches long. We raise them out up until about August. And the hope is in a good year, they'll be like between 7 and 9 inches long before we stock them out. So we stock about 10,000 a year into 6 different lakes. So some of the lakes that we stock are fairly small. So they really only get like 300 fish. So we're raising a lot, but some of these small lakes, based on the number of fish you stock per acre, don't get a lot. So the 4 smaller lakes get their smaller amounts, then a lot of them go into Legend Lake. And that's a fishery there that can be taken advantage by the people that live on the lake and the tribal members. So here's just some of the couple of fish. So the walleyes, as you can see, they do pretty good in the lakes there. Bass, pike. And just for reference, these are like all the little ones that we took pictures of. We didn't do the big ones. So shifting gears once more to lake sturgeon. So some people may know, some people not, but sturgeon have been very important culturally to the tribe, mostly because, they were like the important food source after the winter. So the various bands of the tribe would migrate to the rivers when the sturgeon would come in and utilize them and harvest them through, they would dry them, smoke them, do all the, anything you need to preserve them as long as you can. We're also going to talk about the return of the sturgeon. So they were there and then they weren't there for a long time. And now we're working on getting them back. Then we'll look at our management and some interesting developments and new things in terms of getting them back. So why they're important, as I mentioned, it was the thing in the spring, to coming out of a long winter, that was your important food source to sort of get the tribe back on its feet, after you're eating whatever you had dried. It was usually probably running low. There were some medicines that they used for earaches and tuberculosis. That's stuff I haven't used it myself for any of those things, but that's what the research indicates they used it for. So as mentioned, they harvest them in the spring. And then, this was a big deal for the tribe when they would come up. If they wouldn't show up, you can imagine what would happen with the tribe, from a survival standpoint. So there was a pretty big celebration that happened every year. So I'm not sure about the authenticity of this picture, because you think of the spring and you got this guy's out there without a shirt on, and maybe we were a hardier people back then. I don't know. So Kashina Falls was one of the most important spawning grounds. It's about as far as sturgeon get or could get in the Wolf River system coming up from Lake Winnebago. So typically the bands, a lot of them would come to Kashina Falls and they would set up the camps and they would prepare for, the harvest, the preservation, having a feast. Here they are performing the fish dance, was the traditional dance that they would do when the sturgeon would return each year. So the challenge we have is in 1892, the Shawano paper mill dam was put in. So the two pictures on the bottom are, one is from, I believe, 1900, the one on the right. And the picture on the left is what it looks like today. That is the lowermost dam. And then the top one is the Balsam Road Dam, which is just below the reservation. So it's about 5 miles from the Shawano Paper Mill Dam to Balsam Road, and then another 5 miles from the Balsam Road Dam up to the Kashina Falls. So for reference, you can see the dam locations, the Shawano Paper Mill right here, Balsam Road's here, and Lake Winnebago's down here. So the sturgeon run on the Winnebago is pretty prolific. I don't know, has anybody ever gone to like Shackton or to Shawano to see the sturgeon over there? I mean, if you've never been there, I would highly encourage you to go to one of those places. It's a pretty impressive thing to see that many fish there in one spot at one time. So besides the Wolf River, they also run up the Embarrassed River and the Little Wolf River. So they spread out throughout the system. So as a result of the dams, the last sturgeon at Kashina Falls was speared in 1954. So that's the last known sturgeon that was above the dams. So this is just a picture of if you go by the Shawano Dam or down by a Shackton, what you might see with the numbers of fish that congregate there for the spawning season. So the return of the lake sturgeon. So in 1992, there was a group of Menominees that wanted to revive the sturgeon feast and the fish dance and bring back those cultural things that had been missing. And their original plan was they were just going to go down below Shawano and spear a bunch of sturgeon, get arrested, and see where it went to try and get what they wanted. So the chairman at the time was like, whoa, hang on a second. This might not be the best way to go about this. So the tribe engaged talks with the DNR, and in 1993, the DNR provided sturgeon for the sturgeon feast. And that was the first time for many years. I don't think we have a record of like when the last time that it actually had happened was, but it was the first time in like most people's memory of it actually happening. So as a result of that, we worked together to develop a management plan for the reservation that would help us, one, bring them back and provide them for us, and get them back to their historical spawning grounds. And then once that plan was developed, then it was getting it implemented to make this all work. So the partners in the plan, so the tribe, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the DNR, all work together. So this was a several-year process to make this work. So in 1993 is kind of when this all got off the ground. So it really kind of started just before. So I started working for the tribe in 1995. So it had just started when I started working, and I was pulled in it right from the get-go. So of course, when you get different agencies together, you know, we had to learn how to use our quiet voices and to get along. And, you know, there were some times where, you know, people had different visions of which way it should go, which way it shouldn't go. But ultimately, it ended up in a plan being completed in 1995. So you can see that the big goal was, one, to get the sturgeon back, and two, we wanted to also, besides getting them back in the Wolf River, the Wolf River was designated as like no harvest. So we weren't going to harvest out of the Wolf River. So we developed a put, grow, and take program to put them into Legend Lake. They would grow there, and that would allow tribal members someplace to harvest them without affecting the Wolf River population. So our plan was to develop a population of a certain number of fish. And initially when we started, we were transferring like 20 fish a year. So the goal was through these 20 fish, the hope was they would stay in this 5 mile reach and develop into like a self-sustaining population. So the idea for that is modeled sort of after on the Menominee River. So on the Menominee River, there's also a series of dams up there, and they have self-sustaining populations between each of those dams there. Now the difference is on the Menominee River, on average, I think it's about 30 miles between the dams. So there's a lot more space, a lot more habitat, things like that, than what we find on the Wolf River, which is 5 miles. So bear in mind, there's good habitat there, but not enough for the size of the populations that like you see on the Menominee River. So with the assistance of the DNR, the fish are collected down below the Shawano Dam via electrofishing, and they then would truck them up to the reservation. And we would let them go at Chickadee Creek, which is a little tributary that's right next to the Kashida Falls. And the reason we do that and not go right into the river is because it's really the best access point that we had at that site to get them into the river. So this is a picture from the year of the first releases back in, so in 1995, upon completion of the plan, we got right into transferring fish and bringing them up right from the get-go. So all of the fish initially that we brought up, we put transmitters in because, you know, we're trying to develop population. And we want to know if they're going to stay or they go, which habitat are using, where are they not using, where are they congregating. And so we had a variety of, or 2 different tags that we started with. The one on the left is an external tag, and the battery is a little bit smaller, so it doesn't last as long. The one on the right is an internal tag, so those were surgically implanted. That's about the size of a D-cell battery, so those would last for several years. So with assistance from the DNR and the tribal biologists at the time, we were, you know, going up and down the river and tracking the fish using the radio telemetry to figure out where they were using and where they were using the river and which habitats they were kind of gravitating towards. So what we found is that short 5-mile section probably wasn't quite enough distance. So a lot of our fish we would transfer them. If you had a high water event, they would all just go right downstream. So they don't have a problem getting through Balsam Road Dam. When the gates are open during high water, they just go right through the gates. And then when they get down to Shawano, it's the same thing. They're just going through the gates. So we have reports of fish that were tagged and released at Kashina, sometimes being back in Lake Winnebago in like 2 days. So if you remember how long, how far we were on the map from there, it was like, it's a long ways. And so they're pretty motivated to get back to where they came from. So it was thought, okay, if we move them further up. So we moved some and started going up further to Big Eddy Falls, and we went up to Big Smoky Falls, and then we moved it up to the Dells, and then we moved it up to Sullivan Falls. So we're not really sure about whether sturgeon were that far up historically. So there wasn't a lot of data or anecdotal data or stories that said anything about it being that far up, but there weren't anything that said they weren't that far up either. Long story short, they didn't stay there either. So what we were really finding is sturgeon, being a migratory fish to some degree, want to go back where they came from. So it became a bit of a challenge in, okay, how are we going to do this? This is just a picture of what we were doing. So like when we started, we didn't know a lot. We didn't know it was going to take 6 people to measure 1 fish, and it's like, then we realized it was our inexperience. We were doing it all wrong. I think that was the federal guys telling us what we were supposed to do. Blame it on them. So in Legend Lake, where we have the put ground take fishery, so that gets assessed. When we first started, we were assessing a lot, like almost every year. And then we've tapered it back to every several years. The fish in there are doing quite well. Typically when we assess them, they use gill nets. And most of the time when you hear about gill nets, it's like, like in the Great Lakes, when you use gill nets, you're killing the fish that you catch in the gill nets. Sturgeon are pretty resilient when they get in the net because usually they're just getting tangled in it. They're not getting all the way through like the fish in smaller, where the holes are smaller. So survival rate is really good. So it's the easiest way inside, in a lake, it'd be hard with the depths to try and electrofish them. So netting is the most efficient way that we found to assess them in Legend Lake. So as you can see, they all started out in there for the most part as fingerlings. There were a couple adults put in there, but they've grown up. There's decent populations of good sized fish. So we had a season, like the very first season. So this was the harvest one. And this was modeled after sort of what happens down on Lake Winnebago. So it was going to be a winter spearing season. And we thought this was going to be hugely popular, and we were going to have like 100 tags only. And I think we gave out like 42 tags or something like that the first year. So it didn't turn out to be nearly as exciting as people thought it was, just sitting there staring through a hole in the ice. So we were like, man, back in the day, this would have been easier just to go to the river and get them, right? But so the season still is in place. So it went from that short season, and what it's down to now is like, so the season's open all year round. And if a tribal member happens to catch one, then they call a biologist and he just takes some measurements and things like that so we can get some idea of what people are actually harvesting. So we get reports of people that are spearing on Legend Lake for like bass or pike. And a lot of times they'll see sturgeon, but they won't try and spear them because the gear for bass and pike is a lot smaller than what you'd use for a sturgeon. So they don't try and get them because they're either going to lose them or they're going to like bust up their gear. So typically the ones that people catch are usually like ice fishing, because sturgeon they'll eat a lot of stuff, so if they see a minnow hanging there or whatever, they'll take it. And that's, it's a bonus for whoever gets it. So on average, I asked a guy the other day, on average, I think we get about 3 calls a year from people that actually harvest a sturgeon out of the lake. So 2005, that was our first season. So as I mentioned, we changed that from being a 10-day or month season to open all year round. Initially it was just spearing. Now you can hook and line them, you can spear them. If you can figure out a way to get them, you're allowed to get one basically. So after all that, we came to the proverbial fork in the road. So the sturgeon over the lake are doing great. We don't have a problem with that. They're going good. It's just people aren't spending a ton of effort getting them. So it's turned into like a bycatch fishery. But on the river side, that's where the challenge lies in trying to restore a riverine population. So our original goal was, 300 sturgeon. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it was only 36 adults and then, a variety of ages in between. So that original goal was based on the habitat that they had found and worked with the DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's what people kind of agreed upon. That would be the number that would be self-sustaining. So when we figured out that a self-sustaining population probably wasn't going to be the thing to do, the idea was, how many fish do we need to get up there so that they would just spawn? They could spawn and then go back downstream if they wanted. So in 2011, we entered into an MOU with the DNR to just transfer more fish. So we started transferring 115 fish. And then in 2022, we upped that number again to 170 fish. So that did result in successful spawning at Kashina Falls for the first time that was documented in probably, almost 100 years. So changes that we made in those transfers. So originally when we were transferring, there was an idea that there was, in the Wolf River, there were fish that were what they call the riverine fish that they thought spent their entire life cycle in the river. So when we were transferring fish, we would transfer them in August, in October, and then in the spring. So you're getting a mix of, the theory is, if you get the ones in October, in August, they might be fish that like the river for some reason. And then obviously in spring, you're probably just getting fish that are coming up in the typical run that would just help the spawning effort. But so yeah, there's like one spot, interestingly enough, is not right at the base of the falls where you would think, they would all congregate. But there's one spot off a little island that you can see in that picture where there's like some rubble stuff that is just the right size rock that they seem to gravitate to. So each year, when the water conditions are right, and it all depends on, the weather and how much water, we've had years where a lot of those fish, even though we're transferring more, if the water's high enough, a lot of them just want to go back downstream for whatever reason. But they always seem to gravitate. If we see them and they appear to be spawning, it's always in that one spot. So we haven't observed them anywhere else except that one area. One year they did do larval drift netting to see if the spawning was actually successful besides just seeing them doing their thing. And the year they did that, I think it was after this year where this photo was taken. So we did catch larval sturgeon, little sturgeon about this long in the nets. So they are successfully spawning when they get together. And, this all just contributes to the greater Winnebago system in terms of providing fish in the system. So I mentioned the Balsam Road Dam before. So there's a long history with that dam through relicensing and the tribe getting involved in the relicensing process. So there's a settlement agreement that is tied to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission license that goes with that hydropower facility. And so one of the things in there is to put a fishway in. So we've been working on this fishway thing probably for like 15 years, maybe a little more, in terms of trying to come up with design and then work on getting it installed. So you might say, well, why would you put in a fishway if there's another dam 5 miles downstream? Well, interestingly enough, if you move enough fish, not all of them, even though we're moving, we're up to like 170 a year, not all of those are all dropping back down to Winnebago. So what we found is, I think last year or the year before, 2 years ago, there was a sighting in Red River of fish that appeared to be spawning, which is between the two dams. So they were looking to run somewhere, and the Red River is what they chose. So I don't remember exactly. I think it was somewhere right about here, which is as far as they went up. And then they were observed actually just below a county bridge by a landowner who was just walking down there and saw a bunch of sturgeon down there, and he called the DNR. The DNR went out and verified that, these sturgeon were actually there and they were going about their spawning activity. Interesting note is, so this is another one of those rivers that even though it's a fairly good sized tributary, there was not a lot of history to suggest that sturgeon had utilized that in the past. And a reason for that might be it was historically a trout stream. So like many rivers, this one also has a couple dams on it. So you have in the town of Gresham, I don't know where my thing went here. Oh, there it is. There's two dams, so you have Lower Red Lake and Upper Red Lake created by two different dams. And it's not too far after you get upstream from them, then you actually get back into trout water. So the two reservoirs are probably warming the water enough that it doesn't seem quite like a trout stream, which is why they're probably moving up there instead of historically, like we said, never had a report of anybody going there to get their sturgeon, anything like that. But now they're moving up there, and we actually did a study with some smaller fish. We put some smaller tag fish in the Red River, and the biologists, they were little sonic tags, and they tracked them to kind of figure out where they would go and would they drop right back out, would they take up residence, things like that. In some of the tributaries on the lower Wolf River, like the Embarrass River, you'll find fish in there like all year round that'll just stay in the river for some reason. So we were wondering if they would do that same thing with the Red River. Now, I don't have the results yet back on everything he did in that study. That's something he was just working on last year, but it'd be interesting to see if those smaller fish will try and take up residence in there, or whether they'll just move back downstream. So the fishway design that the tribe was in favor of is a nature-like fishway. So this one right here is an example of that. So this one is up at Winter, Wisconsin, on a dam. The system that this one's on also has lake sturgeon. So lake sturgeon have successfully passed through this fishway that they have here. So it's similar to, I guess, other fishways, but being nature-like. The pools are all built with rock. Sturgeon they're not going to go up like a salmon fish ladder, you know, with high velocities and, you know, the slot weirs and all that kind of stuff. That's not their thing. But if you create a series of pools that they can just meander up and take their time, they seem to do just fine. So the tribe's goal was to pass other species as well. And then we would look at like a limited operation schedule. So it wouldn't necessarily be open all year round, but it would definitely be open during the times when sturgeon would be most likely to use it. So like I mentioned, we're working through that process. The new dam owner is much more engaging and really has been a breath of fresh air for the tribe. The old dam owner would only do whatever he had to and nothing beyond that. So the new owners are like, what does the license say? What do we got to do? Let's start working on this. Let's get this done. Unfortunately for them, they've had a generator failure at the dam. So the dam is not producing any electricity, so they're not deriving any income from it. So they're kind of stuck in a spot of what exactly they want to do with it. So the corporation that bought the dam is a green hydrogen corporation, and their original idea was to buy these small hydros to provide energy for their green hydro plants. So it makes the entire operation green. They were going to buy like 200 of these plants all over the US and then put up their other facilities. I think after they bought Balsam Row and then they bought one in Vermont, and I think they quickly realized that, owning hydros is not the way to, generate green hydrogen. There's way too much into, having to run a hydroelectric plant versus just buying it and getting the energy out of it and not having to do all the maintenance and other things that they're running into. So the owner now is thinking about all options. So I believe they're trying to figure out how do they get out of this without spending as much money as the least amount of money possible. I think they're talking about to revamp it, the dam with a new generator and everything they need would be like around $2 million. So they don't have a lot of running capital since it's not operational other than keeping the water at the level they need to. So they're exploring options from, do we revamp the entire operation, in which they could actually, with modern technology, so remember everything in there is like 100 years old. So with modern technology, they could double the output. So it would be more profitable in that way. But if they're trying to get out of it, do they want to stick $2 million into a dam and then hope they can sell it to somebody and get their money back out of it? So the other option, they were talking about like surrendering a license and removing the dam, which I never thought I would hear anybody ever say at Balsam Row. So it's going to be really interesting in the next year, sort of to see how this whole process works out. Like I said, I never thought in my lifetime of working for the tribe, and the tribe has always said, well, let's just take it out. But it's like, well, there's more to it than just taking it out. There's lots of other things you got to work through. So it's just presenting a very interesting conundrum for the owner. And so right now the tribe is assisting them we've applied for a grant to look at whether or not a feasibility study of looking at the cost of putting in a fishway or just surrendering the license and taking the dam out entirely. So if we get funded with that, we'll be in the next year be going down that path and working with a consultant to try and get answers to some of those questions. And I had to have at least one picture of myself with a fish in there. So with that, we'll take any questions.
Other question? Or are speaking in the microphone, so everybody. Yep, I'm coming. Pretty loud. People on Zoom. I'm curious, you know, since it's been so many decades or centuries since the tribe has harvested sturgeon, were some of the members that did get lucky, did they like YouTube how to clean a sturgeon? Were they spearers on Winnebago themselves, or and also did they share the harvest with the rest of the tribe? Like, was there a ceremony?
So for the people that did them individually, like just on Legend Lake, no. So they didn't have a ceremony and like that, because that could have been like any time during the year. As far as learning how to harvest, I think we had been getting, so I left, you know, we skipped through a lot of stuff. So after that initial ceremony, every year the DNR has been providing us fish to have that ceremony. So there's a group of guys that have been cleaning them and preparing them every year. So that knowledge is there and how to do that. But yeah, I think they relied on, I think, some folks from Lake Winnebago to start with. So the biologist we worked with at the time was instrumental in like trying to bring the parties together that would mutually benefit from us relearning some of those things on how to do that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's, since they've been doing it, they pretty much had it free. So most people are like, if they get one, they're usually just smoking it. And, you know, like a lot of people do with sturgeons.
Other questions?
Wondering, you know, I don't see too many people eating sturgeon. Can you tell us a little bit what part of the fish is the best? What's the best way to take care of to clean a sturgeon?
So I've never personally cleaned one.
Oh,
So I'm not one of those lucky guys. I got one.
well, we see some up here. There are some that wash up on Sunset Park. We saw one last year and then I saw a second one. One was about 3 feet long and another one was about 2 feet. I don't know whether they were caught and thrown away because somebody didn't think they knew much about it. But I don't see anybody preparing sturgeon. You don't see it on the menu.
Yeah, so most places that consume sturgeon are going to be around Lake Winnebago, you know, where you have the spearing season down there. It's a big thing. So it's much like it's a cultural thing for the tribe. That's sort of like a cultural thing for like around Lake Winnebago. And so once you get too far away from Lake Winnebago, people don't know a lot about sturgeon and probably never thought about eating one because it's just, it's not their thing. So I think so I'm going to hazard my best guess at how they clean them. So you can't flay them obviously because they're not the same shape, but you're flaying the meat off the sides, similarly like what you would do with other fish.
So we have sturgeon here. So if we are lake sturgeon, are they much different than the ones that you're dealing with from Winnebago Lake?
They're the exact same fish.
Same thing.
Yeah. So have been fish that have been tagged in Lake Winnebago, and I know there's one for sure. I think that they caught in Lake Erie. So there's some fish just like to wander for whatever reason. Other fish, you know, stay a little closer. But yeah, they're throughout the Great Lakes. Up in Canada, there's a fair number of rivers and other places that have them. I was at a conference once and there was a guy talking, I think he was a hydropower guy, and wherever their dams were, I think they were in like Quebec. Every year they would have sturgeon showing up, like out in the middle of nowhere, these dams where, you know, people back when they put them in didn't document all this stuff. So some of it just, you know, nobody paid attention to it. Other than locals are like, yeah, they're there all the time, but nobody else knew that. So they're quite prevalent, although Mark, you could probably speak a little more on the endangered species. proposal for sturgeon?
I used to be able to. Oh.
Probably Dave.
Yeah, let's get audience participation.
Your question. It's illegal on a hook and line in the state of Wisconsin, except the reservation, to harvest with a hook and line. Only the Winnebago system, you can do it.
Yeah, there,
September, you can do it on the Menominee River.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's true, and that's because it's. Yeah.
So. That's okay, I could just call it out. Where do the sturgeon in the lake, where do they spawn? Do they spawn at the Menominee River or from the source that you have?
the ones in Lake Michigan or the Green Bay?
Well, Green Bay, Sturgeon Bay, and,
Yeah, so there's runs of sturgeon, well, obviously Menominee River, because they have the fish lift up in Menominee that they help move fish up. But historically, you know, well, this actually still happens. The Pyatskowit River gets a run.
Ocado does too.
The Ocado, I was getting there. I wasn't gonna leave it out. Yeah, the Ocado gets up, not as much as like the Pyatskowit and the Menominee do, but, and then the Fox River still gets a run. But the numbers on the Fox, I understand, are a little more limited, and it's a lot harder to assess them because, you know, the river is like 12 times as big as like the Menominee and the Pyatskowit. So yeah, most of the tributaries, to my knowledge, get utilized by sturgeon in the spring.
I have a series of questions. First, can anybody go fishing on the reservation as long as we have a Wisconsin fishing license?
No. And yes, in some places. So Legend Lake is the only lake on the reservation that's open to whoever wants to come in. So the other lakes are only open to tribal members. And I mentioned there's some lakes that have like fee properties on them. So if you're the owner of one of the fee properties there that's on the lake, you can fish on the lake that's there.
Just kind of a little question because I go ice fishing and I go explore a lot of those lakes and I kind of just pop in and that sort of thing. And now I find out that maybe I should have been doing that. Okay. It's good to know. I was just kind of curious on it. Next question was, as far as fish management and what you're doing, do you run into any public outcry of special treatment with sturgeon and things like that? And where I'm going with it is, at the local Quick Creek gas stations, there's this newspaper that they have. You talk about, you know, all different places you can go up throughout Wisconsin. It's a free publication, but in the back there's this group of people, Ellis as they call it. They really rail on the spearing fish and very bad. I don't want to say this. They get it wrong, you know. They're just railing on this whole harvest and things like that. So I was kind of curious. Do you run into any public outcry for what you guys are trying to do and the fish that you get and things like that?
Yeah, we really don't, because I think the biggest difference is, so the tribes in the north where that's a bigger thing, they're like in the ceded territory. So it's like the one thing Menominee has going forward is in our reservation, it's largely contiguous, you know, with the exception of a few smaller land holdings in there. So it's sort of like what happens on the reservation stays on the reservation for lack of a better term. So there's not as much, you know, public visibility, and you know, the spear, it's a little bit, the spearing they do there is a little bit different than kind of like the up north thing. So it's not, you know, we're not dealing with quotas and, you know, having to change bag limits for lakes based on whether it's a speared lake or harvest lake or not, you know, all the various things that go on up there. So the short answer is we're fortunate to not really have to deal with lots of those things.
And just to add a little bit to that, because I talked to him before he gave his presentation, the Menominees also are a tribe that doesn't necessarily have fishing rights outside of the reservation. Where all the other ones may have a sparse reservation, but they have big tracts of areas that they can have treaty rights to go fish there. And that's kind of what happens up north, where they have to allocate some of that harvest to the tribes based on the treaty and stuff. So they have a very unique situation that they're so contiguous in one land area. Right?
Right.
Any other questions? So all the fish for the ceremonies actually comes from the DNR? Or do you actually catch some in the river yourself?
The DNR supplies them. They're coming from below the Shadow Paper Mill Dam.
And maybe another question. So do you do the sturgeon dance?
I do not.
But there must be a big celebration with like powwow or whatever.
There is. So I don't remember the exact date, but it's somewhere around April 12th.
April 12th.
So April 12th at the
High school.
is it at the high school or is it at the Face Center?
It's at the high school.
It's at the high school.
Noon to
So-
6.
Are there, sounds like someone's talking through Zoom. Yeah. Is there anybody on Zoom that has a question or a statement?
I got a question.
Go ahead.
Wei for a really wonderful presentation. Yeah,
Hello?
sorry. Wei for a really wonderful presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. The 33rd Annual Sturgeon Feast and Celebration Powwow is at the Menominee Nation High School, Saturday, April 12th, from 12 to 6. And I was curious, and I can't recommend it enough. It's a pretty fabulous event. As was mentioned, you know, this you see dances that aren't held at other powwows. This is a very special spring powwow, welcoming the sturgeon back. And it's a really, the feast is capital F. I mean, it is amazing. The food is to die for. They feed you really well, and it's all paleo food. You know, no refined food, no sugars. It's all whole food like people ate, you know, for thousands of years. It's a really amazing spread that they put on, and it's just a very welcoming experience. And I can't recommend going to Kashina on the 12th enough.
You broke up.
Sorry?
You broke up a little bit. Did you have another statement?
Oh, yeah. Where are we at with the paper mill dam and getting fish past the paper mill dam?
So right now, there's nothing active going on in terms of the tribe working towards the paper mill. Right now, the efforts have been focused pretty much solely on Balsam Row.
Thank you.
Mine was just a simple question. Is the sturgeon feast open to the public, or do you have to be a tribal member?
No, it's open to the public.
I don't want to show up. Sorry.
Do it. It's amazing.
More questions. Hang on.
For the guy that's casual fisherman, are the launching racks labeled, or are they some kind of sign or something so people know that they're on the reservation or not, or? How does the guy know?
Well, you'll know when you hit the reservation line. There's signs that tell you you're on the reservation. So once you're on, you're on. So like we were talking about earlier, being contiguous. Like up north, you're on the reservation, then you're within the boundaries, but then there's such a mix of tribal land and non-tribal land. It's hard to tell what you're on. With Menominee, when you're on, you're on. You're until you hit the line going off, that there's no question of where you are.
Don't know.
Yeah, I got a question on just being in fisheries as long as you've been for almost 30 years. I know a lot of the DNR guys and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they they are pretty much getting a thankless job a lot of times, a lot of criticism. I'm just wondering what keeps you going, and what's some of your best memories of what you've done, and how do you feel you've accomplished that?
So I think working with the sturgeon is probably the biggest thing, because I mean, it was a really big deal for the tribe to, get sturgeon back on the reservation. And now to continue working towards, we're doing some problem solving and figuring out how to either make them stay or let them get there on their own, however they want to, without having to transfer. I mean, the goal would be at some point off in the future that they would just come on their own. We wouldn't have to do it. Nobody would have to do anything to get them there. So as far as, what keeps us going is the fact that, you're working with the resources that you're preserving for future generations, and you want to make sure that it's around for everyone else to enjoy the way we enjoy them now. So I think that's probably what you hear from DNR people too, because, the resources and, when you work in resources, especially in the state and the feds, they get a lot of heat from everybody, because nobody ever thinks they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But, at some point you got to have faith that they're doing the right thing. And, there's only so much you can do with the money and the manpower that we have anywhere to work on this stuff. So even within the tribe, I think I should get more money from the tribe to, work on the things that we're doing. But I think we're also doing a pretty darn good job with what we have and making sure that we keep those resources around.
So, you stated that some of the sturgeon are spawning, north of the dam or near the dam. Do you have any evidence that the fish that result from that spawning either stay in the river up there or go down to like Lake Winnebago and then come back?
So you're talking about the ones on the reservation that we've seen spot. So we don't have, we don't have any evidence that the ones, the larval fish that successfully were produced, we don't know where they went, where they are now. The assumption is that since they're in a riverine system, they're going to do what sturgeon do in a riverine system, which is usually they drift downstream. When they reach a certain size, they're like hard to find in general. This is like anywhere in the Winnebago system. And so it's hard to say out of the ones that we've had spawning there, whether or not they've come back or not. So the other thing to remember is, sturgeon reach maturity at like 25 years. So we're not even quite to the age where they would be making that run back up yet. But the hope is that, by having successful spawning, you're contributing to the overall good of the system.
The population on the reservation, are there a lot of kids or young adults? Because I know that fishing is kind of coming back in the schools. They're having fishing clubs, and you see a lot of kids out fishing in a county. How is it on the reservation? Are the kids, you have a lot of kids, and are they taking on fishing?
So we have lots of kids and lots of kids that like fishing. So I think it follows the same trend everywhere, like lots of kids are interested at a young age. So our biologist works with school groups and other groups besides school groups to, doing presentations, talking about fish, the work that we do. There are several, especially in the winter, there's several youth fishing derbies for, just specifically for kids, things like that. So it's promoted, kids are doing it. My program always promotes it, because what's better than getting in the outdoors, right?
Any other questions?
Well, that was a wonderful presentation, and thanks so much for coming over. You've done a lot.
Thank you all for coming. It's a little bit different twist than what we've been doing, but it was very informative, wasn't it? We have one more, April 17th, learn about the secrets from mass market. Thank you very much, and hope to see you then.
Hi.
My name's Michaela. I'm the like curator of the resources society right over here. And I last year, well, 2 years ago, did a project where we like before I started, I got a grant to do basically tell us the story of the tribes, which I had like 4 months. Like, tell them this is the entire story of all the tribes. Here you go. So you may have possibly